This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The second China International Import Expo kicked off on November the 5th in Shanghai with over 3,000 businesses from 150 countries in attendance. The expo aims to boost the import of goods and services and offers Africa the opportunity to tap into the growing Chinese market. Now, during the first expo in 2018, more than 1 million people attended and deals worth a total of $57.8 billion were signed. This year, every African country is represented, and the expo has attracted even more exhibitors from around the world. This week, we ask whether China's expanding free trade zones and open trade policies are providing a greater impetus for African countries to tap into the growing Chinese market. And how best can Africa leverage this? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Chinese President Xi Jinping opened the second China International Import Expo on November the 5th with a promise to ease market access, counter protectionism, and boost economic globalization. Our correspondent Zhou Yun brings us more from Shanghai.
Building a shared future in the new era. While addressing the CIIE's opening ceremony, President Xi Jinping said that China has made great progress in expanding imports to promote consumption and reducing trade barriers as part of the nation's efforts to further open up its market. He also expressed strong opposition to protectionism and unilateralism, calling for countries to jointly build a world economy of openness and cooperation.
The challenges that the global economy faces cannot be tackled by a single country alone. Countries should uphold the concept of putting humanity first and should not let their own interests override that of the mankind. We must have a more open mindset and take steps to work together to make the global market even bigger. We need to strengthen the mechanisms for sharing globally and explore new ways of international cooperation. We should put more focus on globalization and remove obstructions as much as we can.
Since the first CIIE, numerous concrete measures have been carried out in areas like widening foreign access, improving China's business environment, and increasing service imports. Those have not only reinforced global confidence in the Chinese market, but also earned the expo itself a good reputation. And this time, President Xi put forward 3 proposals for economic globalization, including jointly building an open and cooperative world economy, jointly building an open and innovative world economy, and jointly building an open and sharing world economy. Moreover, China will also adopt 5 measures to promote high-level opening up in areas such as opening up its market and improving its business environment.
中国将不断完善 市场化、法治化、国际化的营商环境。
China will continue improving the country's business environment, making it more international and market legislation oriented. We will expand market access for foreign investment and continue reducing the negative list. We should also improve the investment promotion and protection mechanisms and information report system.
He also called on countries to strengthen protection of intellectual property rights and oppose knowledge blockades to avoid creating or even widening technological divides. The world has become increasingly aware about the huge consumption potential in the Chinese market, and that is why this Import Expo is seen as a golden opportunity for companies not only here in China, but also around the world to tap into the shared benefits and also prosperity. Zhou Yun, CGTN, Shanghai.
Well, joining me now to unpack the impact of the 2019 China International Import Expo and what it means for Africa from Beijing, Qiu Mi, the Deputy Director, Institute of American and Oceania Studies. He's also a senior researcher at the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. From Johannesburg, we have Dr. David Monyai. He's the co-director at University of Johannesburg Confucius Institute. And with me in studio, Ken Gishinga, the chief economist, Mentoria Economics here in Nairobi. Gentlemen, welcome to Talk Africa. Mr. Chow Mein, let me start off with you because you're following developments from China. Could you give us an overview of the exhibition so far? What stands out for you at this point?
I would say that from my point of view, I would say that there are 4 characteristics of the CIIE this time. The first one is inclusive, that you can see that there are some old friends come again after last year, and there are some new friends, and there are all kinds of different types of enterprises, not only from the top 500 country enterprises, but also some enterprises from some least developed countries. So I would say that is inclusive. The second is that there is a combination of the products or commodity and the service. We will see that there are a lot of attractive things, not only to the factories, but also to the consumers. There are also a lot of services embedded in the products and or have some relations with them. The third one is that the characteristic of the keep word or the credit. So I would say that President Xi has mentioned that we have fulfilled a lot of our promise last year, and we are trying to open it wider and wider this year. And the fourth one is that I would say that is innovation, because we were not trying to do something as the old style. We are trying to encourage the innovation, not only from the governance theory, but also from some practice or even the skills or technologies.
So, Mr. Xiao, I just want to follow up on that because you've mentioned 4 areas that are very inclusive this year. But of last year's deals, the 3 industries that stood out were mainly manufacturing, food and agriculture, automotive industry. Where are you seeing the deals being signed this year around? Where are you seeing the most interest?
I would say that, if the consumers want to go there, they would be very interested in the new energy, automobiles, or some new technology like in the housing, houseware, and or some different kinds of technology who can use in the daily life. But if there are some people from the factories, they may find it's very interesting to have more cooperation with the world-leading companies, like in some technology or research or other kind of cooperation.
Let's come back to Africa here for a minute, because China is Africa's largest trade partner today. We have heard that there is a lot of interest in the automotive, in the technological. China is further opening up to another level. What is Africa, though, bringing to this market?
Well, I think if you look at China's main imports, they're mostly in the agricultural space in terms of food products. And I think countries such as Kenya, for example, last year we saw a big rise in avocado exports from Kenya to China. So I think when you build on agricultural produce and you go into value addition, I think those are the areas where we are seeing lots of growth. China has a 1.4 billion market, so ability to feed that population. It's with a growing middle class. I think those are some of the exciting talking points that should excite people here in Kenya. Although I have to say that the follow-up has always been a bit more challenging than the policies that have been put in place. So I think a big theme has to be, yes, the policies are good on paper, but can we make it easy for businessmen, for farmers in Africa to be able to follow through, because that has been the challenge last year.
But there have been a further reduction in tariffs, though, from China in terms of allowing more import into the country. How is Africa, though, taking advantage of that?
Well, Africa, when I talk about the challenges, I'm not really talking about the tariffs. I'm really talking about the non-tariff barriers. For example, if you specifically look at the avocado segment in Kenya, out of 100 farms that produce avocado, only 1 of them has qualified to be able to export it to China because of some of the requirements needed. You have to freeze the avocados to negative 30 degrees. You have to peel them. You have to continuously freeze them again while in transit, which means you have to have expensive coolers, which a lot of farmers are unable to afford. So I think those are sometimes what we call the non-tariff barriers in terms of that need to be addressed before we can say the full uptake of these policies really bring the full impact on the ground.
Mr. Chow Mein, though, Your thoughts on the tariffs and the non-tariff barriers, because some of the measures announced by President Xi included promoting a higher level of opening up, about optimization of the business environment by further reducing tariffs. From a Chinese perspective, though, how would the world and Africa, for instance, take advantage of this?
I would say that I agree that there are so many things that we can do. The first one is that the market is the most important thing. That in China we have a very big market. So I would say that these things has provided a lot of opportunities, not only from the quantities of the consumption power, but also from the industrialization, the urbanization, and the integration of the China different parts. And I also want to mention that about the barriers, that we are trying to facilitate the trade not only in the customs. We are also trying to bridge the informations between the suppliers and the demands. So I would say that is kind of very important practice, like the e-commerce. We are trying to encourage enterprises to building better platform, and we also cooperate with other countries to reduce the information asymmetries.
Dr. Munya, in terms of bridging that information gap so that importers or trade partners can know what to expect on the Chinese side, is that being felt, though, on the continent?
I think the continent has a lot of work to be done. I agree fully with my colleagues. And the issue of avocado in the Kenyan case, I think it's a classical example that the entire African continent produces lots of raw material. I think the continent has to seriously think of these opportunities that are opening in China. I think what is needed is to do market research. More work is needed, and deal with some of the bottlenecks that limits the trade between Africa and China. And that has to do with the issues of connectivity, and not just connectivity with China, but African countries among themselves. I think what is central is a question of thinking of industrialization in terms of taking this raw material to finished goods, and so that we can sell at a much more high value within Chinese market.
For value add to happen, there needs to be industrialization to add the value to sell to a global market. The onus here, though, is for African countries. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I think African countries have to do a lot more in terms of investing in manufacturing. One of the challenges here has been the cost of energy in countries such as Kenya. I think that has prevented the manufacturing sector from thriving. In Kenya, for example, manufacturing contributes to about 9% of the GDP, and it ought to be about 15%. So I think looking at the bottlenecks and asking ourselves, doing some soul searching to ask, why is value addition so hard in Africa? Is it just about labor? Is it about energy? Is it about, are there other bottlenecks? I think these are the serious questions that policymakers must look at, because as my colleague has said, the Chinese market is very sophisticated. They do not just want raw produce from Africa, they want refined produce. So I think that has to be the million-dollar question on how we can achieve that in the shortest time possible.
Right, but we're coming to the second CIIE, though, at the point when Africa has recently launched the Continental Free Trade Area, and that opens up a complete new market of 1.2 billion people, 1.4 billion in China. How do you see, though, the African continent in terms of the connectivity that Dr. Munya has talked about? How do you see the African continent taking advantage of its own CFTA market to progress further and access further the Chinese market?
I think the opportunity is big, but I think the uptake has been slow. First of all, the colonial legacies that African countries have with their European counterparts have been there for about 5 decades. So to undo that and to have African countries look at the regional opportunity will take time, both from a cultural perspective, from a social perspective. So it's not something that will happen overnight. But you're right, when you look at East Africa alone, we are seeing a market of close to 200 million people. And we are seeing banks, we are seeing telcos, Safaricom wanting to go to Ethiopia. So it takes time, because sometimes I think the expectation on the ground is these things happen overnight, but there is a lag effect until to the point where you'll see the dollars really reaching the ground.
Right, Dr. Munya, your thoughts on the CFTA and its accessibility?
There are also, in addition to what my colleague has just alluded to, is that there are certain advantages that Africa has, the ability of the continent to leapfrog when it comes to technology. You can just see the role of China in terms of cell phones, IT development on the African continent. I think it's an area that we can say more is being done. I think what is needed is to develop it even further within countries and intra-Africa trade using this modern way of trading, the e-commerce that is being spoken about within China, and to ensure that when we trade with China, we trade in a fair as well as understanding this two-way, quicker, more efficient, and ensure that we don't spend a lot of time on transportation and other issues, which remains a huge problem on our continent.
All right, Choumi, Ken Gishinga, and Dr. Munyai, do stay with us. We are going to take a short break now. When we return, we'll have more on how Africa can benefit from China's new open trade policies. Don't go away.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me on the program from Beijing, Choumi, Dr. David Munyai from Johannesburg, and Ken Gishinga with me in studio. Before we took the break, we looked at some of the highlights of the China International Import Expo so far. Let's now look at how Africa can take advantage of China's more optimized trade policies. And we're going to take a look at the global economy here, Dr. Munyai, because President Xi Jinping talked about 3 proposals for global economic revitalization. The global economy at the moment is rather sluggish. Now, he talks about building an open world economy through cooperation, through innovation, and building a shared world economy. How do you see these proposals, though, injecting a new growth in the global economy?
I think it will go a long way in dealing with some of the issues that the world is facing. It is a world in which, while China is opening, most Western countries are closing their markets. And therefore, I think the speech speaks quite and pointed to the right areas that of great interest to the African market. I think it is in that context that the continent itself, like China, is also speaking of opening up with its the trade agreement that has been signed recently. So I think you see much more synergies between Africa and China. I think more needs to be done still, especially on the African continent, in dealing with infrastructure development, emphasizing the industrialization issues and ensure that this trade is balanced. It's also in favor of Africa. So those are some of the issues in terms of the details. China has an advantage. It sets goals, and within a year and 2, it achieves those goals. While our continent, more of issues that has been discussed are on paper, and it really takes time for the continent with 54 countries to really speak with one voice and achieve the goals that they set among themselves, as well as in their relationship with China.
Ken Gishinga, your thoughts?
I couldn't agree more. When I think about infrastructure, for example, and the Belt and Road Initiative, I see China that's looking for a win-win solution. Because if you look at the investments it's making in the SGR, in Kenya, for example, in Tanzania, this infrastructure development will help countries in Africa, but will also help China in terms of being able to reach those markets in terms of imports and exports. So I think the whole theme of new era, one future, shared value, I think that's the sagacity and the consistency that we are seeing from Chinese foreign policy.
Right. Show me, though, President Xi highlighted China's huge market potential, though. And at the moment, the projection for 2019 global projection for 2019 is at 3.2%. In what ways do you see China's pledge of a more dynamic domestic market, though, injecting momentum into the global growth?
Yeah, that you may find from the projection of the IMF that China's economy is also be slowed down in the prediction of this year and maybe next year. But there is only a very small download about. It's at about 0.1% compared with the prediction of the last time. So I would say that China is also trying to do something change. Not only by the import and export, we are also trying to adjust our economy structure. So I think that is kind of two ways cooperations with China and the other world. We should try to, first of all, I think we should try to keep a stable increase in the domestic market. It is not only for us, it is also important for the other countries in the global supply chain. And the second is we are trying to cooperate with other countries to do something to improve the demand side. That is through the infrastructure cooperation, the investment, or other kind of cooperation method that we can try to enlarge the global demand or try to keep it sustainable.
Right. Ken, though, when we talk about globalization here, we see some of the countries, the developed world, that have benefited from globalization. Some of them have become rather resistant to globalization, even though China is now quite a leader in advancing globalization and combating protectionism. Why is there so much resistance from the countries that have benefited from globalization?
That's a very correct assessment. If you think of the world post-1945, post-World War II, we see the G7 countries really being at the forefront of globalization. But as many academics and economists have pointed out, the benefits of globalization have not been disproportionately distributed across the world. There's a feeling that the profits have really been concentrated amongst a few. So in a sense, the people who are fronting this now have become the gatekeepers, really preventing that from happening. So what China is really introducing is a new type of globalization, one that's anchored on big countries and small countries sitting on the same table, and really removing away this whole club of countries that dominate global geopolitics. So I think it's a fresh take on globalization. Will it work in the same way as the first one did? I think those are some of the things that we have to debate moving forward.
Why is there so much resistance now, though, from those countries?
Well, I think obviously the benefits that they have accrued in terms of what I've said in terms of profits have really been skewed in one direction. So to be able to rock that mothership, if you like, is not something that many of those countries would want to anticipate. Then you have issues around migration that are coming in, where you have people from poor countries trying to enter those economies. Because remember, globalization is really about free movement, free labor, free movement of labor and capital. But when you find a lot of immigrants moving into those countries, threatening their cultures, threatening their stability, threatening their social fabric, these countries now start saying, hold on, I think we need to preserve our identity, we need to preserve our heritage. So they become now the fiercest enemies of globalization. And we're seeing the rise of different political parties, whether it's in Europe or in the US, really against free movement of labor, against very anti-immigrant cultures. And I think that is really the chicken coming home to roost.
So Dr. Manyai, as we wind up this program, though, your sentiments on developing countries now demanding a share at the table. The 2019 Expo, though, the theme for this year is a new era, shared future. In your opinion, what needs to happen to create a more inclusive global economy?
I think what is needed first and foremost, we need peace in the world. We really need to deal with peace on our African continent to ensure that peace becomes a precondition. And the lesson we've learned from China since 1949 is they celebrate 70 years of freedom in China, is that peace was at the center of the development that they're enjoying. And therefore, I think at a global level, for globalization to move smoothly, we have to cooperate on a number of areas in the security sector, and we move beyond the traditional trading routes, as well as support the rise of the Belt Road Initiative to ensure that we play a critical role as the African continent, so that we have our products, finished products, ensure that they enter the Chinese market. But we need to think beyond the Chinese market. We would like to see African products entering markets in former Soviet countries in Eastern Europe using the very same Belt Road Initiative. We also need to think of our cultures, our civilization, that we contribute to ensure that within the Belt Road Initiative are not just goods traveling from one point to another, but issues of values, norms, culture, language, a number of whole things that move within the belt. And Africa needs to play a critical role to ensure that Africa's own civilization is acknowledged and respected at a global level.
Xiaomi, I want to get your thoughts on the theme for this year, New Era, Shared Future. How do we share in that future? How do we create a more inclusive global market?
I would say that global market is, it's a very important thing, is to keep the rules. As the professor has mentioned that the developed country has set up some rules like in WTO, and they just want to, some of them just want to leave that rule. But I mean that since we have put a lot of efforts, not only in China but also in other countries, to try to adapt ourselves to the international rule, that is something that we think it's fair, because you should try to change yourself to the system and try to obey your commitments. So I would say that without the commitments, without the credits, the world can never be a very prosperous one. So I think that we should try to do something. If the WTO cannot do, maybe it will be malfunctions by United States or by other countries for the mechanism, we should try to do something more, like in the FTA or in other kind of regional agreements. So I mean that we should try to establish some mechanism for the corporations, because because of that, we can have a more stable environment for the business to invest or doing business. Otherwise, the companies can only think about the short-term return of the investment. So I would think that the mutual benefit should be based on the trust, and we should try to do something to improve the environment for the enterprises.
Ken, building on your thoughts of a new era for globalization, how will then that create a more inclusive global growth?
Well, the pillars of the new era has to be around trust, it has to be around contract enforcement, it has to be around companies feeling when they invest in other countries that they will get the equal treatment as the home companies in those countries. I think these things are highlighted by the media, they're highlighted by other discourse on free trade, and I think this is the only direction. So I think shedding more light, more transparency, more in terms of intellectual property protection, I think those are the things that really build investor confidence. And if we can see all countries really converging around that theme, I think we can see a much, much brighter hopes of peace and prosperity.
Gentlemen, very interesting discussion indeed. We'll leave it there for the moment. That's all for this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests. Xiaomi, the Deputy Director, Institute of American and Oceania Studies. Dr. David Monyai, Co-Director, University of Johannesburg at the Confucius Institute. And Ken Gishinga, Chief Economist, Mentoria Economics in Kenya. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.